I think having a strong culture, and what does that mean? It means shared values and shared norms of what is okay, what is not okay, what do we care about, what do we not care about. I mean, that is really, I think, the glue that keeps people going in the same direction.
Welcome to High Stakes, the podcast committed to demystifying the institutional adoption of blockchain technology. I'm your host, Alex Nwaka, and today we're elevating the Web3 discourse in a series of conversations with industry iconoclasts that are shaping the future of Web3. Now let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of High Stakes. I'm your host, Alex Nwaka, and today I am joined by Alex Pruden, who is the executive director at Aleo. Alex has a really amazing background, spent some time in the military, then ended up in the venture capital sphere covering crypto, and now been on the operating side for a little bit of time as well. So Alex, welcome to High Stakes.
Hey, yeah, it's great to be here. And by the way, since both our names are Alex, you feel free to refer to me as either Alex or AP. It's a lot of Alexes in crypto, so I do go by AP sometimes, but it's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Awesome. Going for AP just to keep it easy. So AP, I always say there's not really a well-worn path into either venture or into crypto. I think that everybody that met in those two spheres kind of ends up there, in a unique set of ways. But I would say that, even your background is, I think, an outlier even relative to that. You spent some time in the military and then jumped into crypto. That strikes me as very unique. And so maybe talk a little bit about how that all happened, what initially got you interested in crypto, and then we can sort of take the conversation from there.
Yeah, sure. So I joined the military right out of high school. Part of my family's had a long military tradition. I'm the fifth generation member of my family to serve in the U.S. military. And as I was graduating high school, just 2 years before was 9/11. So, it's kind of a time in American history where there was a lot of focus on national security. And so it ended up being what I decided to do with the early part of my career. A lot of experiences as part of that brought me overseas. So I was deployed 3 times to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Turkey/the Syrian border, respectively. And actually the last deployment to Turkey was when we were training. I was there with a special forces team, and we were training some folks who were Syrian, basically moderate Syrian opposition to the Assad regime. And I kind of accidentally discovered Bitcoin. At the time, there were no Americans allowed to be actually operating in Syria. Now there are Americans that operate in the Kurdish part. But at the time, there was a pretty strong restriction to actually having American boots on the ground. But we were training folks. So the folks we were training were Syrians. They were coming out. We were training them. They were going back in. And then, we needed to support them. And one of the ways that we needed to support them was like with money to buy on the economy various things, right? And so one suggestion that actually came from one of our Turkish counterparts was like, hey, instead of giving these guys bags of cash, which is a big, inconvenient and dangerous in many ways, why don't you just pay them in Bitcoin? And none of us knew what Bitcoin was. So that's sort of what led me down the rabbit hole, Bitcoin. And the whole kind of US Army paying Syrian rebels in Bitcoin never went anywhere. Shortly after our mission started, the Russians intervened in the Syrian civil war and the whole thing kind of petered out. But the idea of Bitcoin, after having dug into it, really stuck with me, particularly around the refugees use case, because a lot of these folks we were training were refugees, either internal to Syria or had fled to Turkey. In that process, many of them had to leave behind enormous amounts of wealth, either because it was in a Syrian bank account that they couldn't easily get access to in Turkey or somewhere, or in the sense that it was like in real property. And so the idea that really caught me was like, hey, I'm fleeing from a war zone. I have 15 minutes to get my kids in the car and everything of value that I own. And like, what if I could just put basically my life savings in my head as a private key or a seed phrase, and then I can get in the car and go, and then I can start my life over again wherever. And that idea, I was like, holy shit, this is incredible. Like there's nothing that exists like this. And how much better could these people's lives have been had they had that option? So that's what really led me down the space of crypto. Yeah. So that's how I first got into it. And then, later got more and more into it as I was a Stanford graduate student after my military career. And then, as you mentioned, I ended up in VC and then finally at an operating company. We can talk about that, I guess, if you want to go that direction.
Yeah. I'm actually curious. You mentioned, after the military, you were at Stanford, and obviously one of the forefront institutions as it relates to sort of blockchain technology, but just overall. But curious that during the time that you were there, especially in sort of the business school, were you sort of an outlier as somebody that, just looking at your background, right, you sort of jumped right into blockchain really once you hit Stanford GSB, and then, the rest sort of history. So talk to me a little bit about what it was like. Were you an outlier? Were you like the only person, really into blockchain technology at the time at GSB? Just fill that in for us.
Pretty much. Yeah. I mean, in getting to GSB, I feel very fortunate to have gotten in. I mean, I came back from that deployment I just mentioned, made the decision to get out of the military, and I knew I wanted to get into crypto, but this is 2016. I was like, there's far fewer opportunities at the time, particularly for someone with no tech background. I studied political science and Arabic in college. Zero tech experience or background, nothing. And so my wife had gone to get her MBA, and she's like, well, if you go get an MBA somewhere, you can figure it out. And I had an opportunity to attend Stanford as a veteran, so there's like a good GI Bill opportunities. So like, anyway, I had the chance to get there, I think largely in part due to that. But when I was there, I was like, okay, great, I'm here. Stanford was one of the schools I had looked at because they did have a pretty strong history in terms of crypto, like, in the cryptocurrency kind of, to the extent there wasn't any kind of academic body of work around it. One of the cryptography professors at Stanford had written a book, and there was kind of interest. So anyway, I show up there, and in the business school, though, as you referenced, like nobody at all was looking at crypto. There was one other guy who I think was running a crypto fund and then ended up dropping out because this is 2017 now. I started the summer of 2017, and this was the first bull market that I participated in, which was the ICO craze. So Ethereum had launched a year or so before, and you had basically just a bunch of people launching ERC20 tokens. And so that was kind of just catching fire when I started, and it quickly kind of faded. That bull market, I think, was pretty short-lived. After a few months, everything kind of, Bitcoin went up to like 20K and then crashed. And then everything kind of died, and everyone assumed the space was dead, right? This is always how it goes in these bull and bear market cycles. But, and then I was kind of the only one. So I was like, well, I want to really get into the space. What do I do? So I started the Stanford Blockchain Club with a couple other business students of mine. That ended up starting out as a business school thing, and we expanded to the whole campus. I was really interested in getting more in depth technically. And so I just kind of jumped in the deep end of the pool. My first computer science class ever in my life was a master's level cryptography course. I actually just saw the professor at an event a few months ago, and I reminded him that I got a D in his class, but I learned an incredible amount, and it kind of inspired me a real passion for cryptography, obviously as an underlying technology of cryptocurrency. And and I was just basically just trying to learn as much as I possibly could, from talking to people in the space by inviting them to the Stanford Blockchain Club, from taking whatever courses and that I could take, and just trying to get smarter and smarter. So then at Stanford, I also ended up getting 2 venture jobs. My first job, actually, after the Army, I was a student, and then it was the kind of the ICO craze, and there was a venture firm named GGV Capital. It was like one of these ones in Menlo Park, and they're like, hey, there's crypto. We want to get a pulse on it. We need somebody to be an analyst or something. And so I'll never forget the resume that I submitted to them, because I had obviously all my Army stuff, which is, kind of no one knows how to read. But before that, my last civilian experience was a customer service representative at Blockbuster Video, which I branded as my first failed startup. Because in the Valley, you want to get credit. You've been to failed startups. So I was like, I was a CSR at Blockbuster. Anyway, so I ended up working for them. It's on a part-time basis and learning a lot through that. I ended up having an internship at Coinbase. I was the first business student they hired as an intern to work on the corporate development team for Emily Choi and Max Brandsburg. And they are respectively the president and the chief product officer now. And so that was a really great experience. And then, I ended up getting an opportunity to work at A16Z.
With A16Z, I believe you were there sort of 2019 to 2020, sort of a really interesting perch, sort of based on those years. And I guess first thing I would ask you is what did you observe at that time? What did you sort of learn being at A16Z, sort of specifically? I assume that was a really foundational experience for you in your sort of crypto career.
Yeah, it was an incredible experience for a multitude of reasons. First off, I ended up there, I guess I should just quickly say, I got there, actually, the cryptography professor who I was taking this course from was an advisor, and they were similarly looking for an analyst type person, and introduced me. And long story short, I ended up getting connected with a woman named Katie Hahn, who was a partner in the first fund there. She now has her own fund. She has a national security background as well, mainly on the DOJ side. And I think we hit it off because of that. And she ended up bringing me on as a deal partner, which is kind of like a principal at any other investing firm. It was a great perch to see everything going on in the industry. I think that's one of the best things, the coolest things about being in VC, is you get to kind of look out across the horizon and see everything. And I think that's really interesting and unique, particularly at that time, because I think at that time in 2019, DeFi was kind of a new-ish concept, right? I think, you think about projects like Compound and MakerDAO. Maker's still around. I think a lot of people have kind of forgotten about Compound, but Compound was an early kind of money market type of on-chain money market type thing. And Maker was, of course, the first decentralized stablecoin, which had a lending protocol underneath it. Just seeing how that was starting to develop. Uniswap was a project that A16Z invested. We invested in as a Series A. That started as just an idea that was on a blog, right? And so basically, it was really cool to be able to see a lot of these primitives get turned into startups, which are now, of course, like Uniswap is a pillar of the space. And so I think that was really cool. And it's also at maybe a more personal level, it was really impactful for me in my career because I got to meet everybody in crypto. I think compared to what it is now, I think there's a 1/100th of the number of people working in it. So you could actually go to a conference like ETH Denver and everyone would fit in one building and you could basically meet everybody, every investor, every builder. I mean, there really were not that many people. So it was a very small, tight knit space. And so I got to kind of expand my network very quickly. And that was hugely valuable for me as just someone who's basically just getting into it.
Any lessons that you learned just through osmosis being around folks like Katie, Ben, Mark, Chris Dixon, anything from, that comes to mind there that you just said, gosh, I just absorbed a lot being around those folks?
I mean, all those people were incredible mentors to me. And I think, I learned a great deal from them. I think maybe just generally speaking, I'll say about A16Z is I think the thing that really stuck with me about that experience was that Mark and Ben are obviously two of the best known investors in the Valley, but they're also entrepreneurs. I mean, Mark famously started Netscape. And, Netscape, for those of you who aren't familiar, Netscape was the first web browser. It wasn't the first, but it was the first big one. In addition to that innovation, they pioneered SSL. They created SSL, which is the secure socket library, which basically is all of the encryption we use on the web today. So hugely influential. And then Ben was I think it was a product manager under Mark at Netscape. And then Ben ended up having his own startup. And so they were both founders multiple times over. And then they started A16Z. And that was, I think the DNA of that place was very much just about supporting founders and supporting it, like building the future, as opposed to, I think, obviously being exposed to some of the private equity world through my classmates at Stanford. I think some of it is just more about like financial returns and like obviously VCs need a return. And A16Z has, of course, been successful at being a good investment. But, in general, I think that the culture was very much about enabling and supporting founders. And Ben in particular, I would say, one thing that I really admired about him was just culture was something that's very near and dear to his heart. And he had a quote that he loved to share, which is, I think it's like an anonymous source, but it's like a kind of in the Bushido school of Buddhism. It was like a Bushido quote or something. And it's like culture is a set of actions, not a set of beliefs, basically. So it's like what you do, not what you say. And I mean, the biggest way that was interpreted at A16Z was no one showed up late. Being late was like a very much like not a thing that you did unless you wanted to get a real nasty stare from Mark Andreessen or somebody, whoever was heading the meeting. And I think that's something I took away because I guess, this is also true in the military. Look, I think organizations, in particular organizations that are, kind of remote, right, where people are not together all the time. I think having a strong culture, and what does that mean? It means shared values and shared norms of what is okay, what is not okay. What do we care about? What do we not care about? I mean, that is really, I think, the glue that keeps people going in the same direction. And Ben, I think, was really kind of passionate about, building at A16Z. I think he was pretty successful at it. And it's something that I've tried to take with me as I've been over at Aleo with varying degrees of success, probably. But
you referenced this before. Sitting in a venture seat is very much nice because you get to see a variety of different things and actually, frankly, make like sort of multiple bets, right, in sort of different ways. So you get to play a bunch of different sort of opportunities. When you go into a more operating role, right, it's more of a, sort of a single bet, right? You're betting with, sort of all your time, all your energy and so forth. And so talk to us a little bit about the decision to move from sort of like the venture seat into more of an operating role. Was that something that, just more natural for what you wanted for your skill set and so forth? Or how did you think about it?
Yeah, sure. I would say so I gave the upside at A16Z, work with amazing people who are storied founders themselves in Silicon Valley, have a perch where you can see everything. To me, the downside was the game is still investing. And part of that game is about soliciting dollars from limited partners to be able to invest in what's next. And I think this is like true of the VC world generally, is there's sort of like two conversations going on all the time. There's like general partner talking to all their LPs and presenting the future and all their investments about being part of that future. And then there's like general partner selecting, talking to founders and like that. There's always this like duality. Frankly, I just didn't care much for the go out and like raise a bunch of money from big pension funds and hedge funds and do it. I cared a lot more. I was much more passionate about the technology itself, problems that I thought I could solve, and the founders that were solving those problems. I just found myself having more and more of an affinity for the operators over time than for like the investors. It was cool to be able to talk to founders. And I obviously was very thrilled to support them. And I was part of some investments that I thought were really special at A16Z. But in general, I was always like, man, I feel like I'm a second order contributor to this world that I want to see. I would really like to be a first order contributor. I don't want to enable the people building the future. I want to build the future, right? So that's sort of what led me down the path of leaving A16Z. I think the other downside I would say about venture is, and this is particularly true of a place like A16Z where it's like, you're always getting the best version of everything. Right. So, and you're getting 50, not 50, but yeah, probably 50 a week, actually 50 pitches a week. And I think you get very good at being able to assess businesses at a pretty high level, but you lose a lot of the details, right? And I think it's been fascinating to me as I've reflected upon my venture experience. Now, having been an operator in the space for 4 years, I'm like, wow, there was so many things I did not even realize or know or appreciate. And it's sort of by nature, right? Like you just don't have time to get that deep when you get 50 pitches a week. That's just how it is. So for me, it's been really cool to be able to get at a much, much deeper level into this technology. One of the things that I've learned along the way as part of that is there are very rarely new ideas. There are occasionally breakthrough new ideas, but a lot of ideas that you hear bandied about in pitches these days from different crypto startups are honestly repackaged versions of things that were proposed in the Bitcoin era. I mean, honestly, Reddit, like crypto subreddit, is probably just a treasure trove of startup ideas. You literally just take something that like died on the vine in 2016 and like rebrand it. Probably, so it's an alpha leak there.
Totally right. I mean, I think there's a lot of credence to that, not only in crypto, but, in technology in general, right?
Definitely.
There's a lot of, timing, I think, that comes into like whether something is successful or not, is the macro, sort of receptive to that technology taking shape. And then to your point, a lot of this comes down to execution, sort of the right team around the right concept at the right time. And so getting that mix of things right is really where, the breakout disruptive companies, the generational companies are sort of built. And it's interesting you mentioning that, sitting in the investment role and then being on the operating side. I've had the benefit of doing that myself. And I've always been struck with like, I didn't even know which questions to ask,
Totally.
just in certain instances. And I think it just makes you a better investor or a better
100%.
evaluator of businesses as well. And so I think that's why you see folks do that revolving door, consistently in the venture space, because I do think that there's a lot of value there. Maybe just quickly on, you had, a really nice perch where you're looking at a lot of different projects, week to week in the venture space. You have a great network. Why did you decide on Aleo being sort of the place that you wanted to, spend all of your time?
Like I said, I was kind of studying cryptography at Stanford on the side as for my MBA. And that's where I learned about this concept of zero knowledge cryptography. And just the quick high level definition for everybody is be able to prove a fact without revealing why that fact is true or not. You're just saying it's true or false. And there's nothing else about the computation or the proving of why that's true. It gets revealed. And there's not really a physical analog. If you think about poker, like me and you are playing poker, and it's like, you're like, hey, I have 5 of a kind. You're like, well, I would love to see these 5 of a kind, right? And I want you to show me. That's like the only way to like verify in the real world is to see it. Right. I think this paradigm of zero knowledge cryptography is very special because in this digital world, or really this mathematical construct, you can prove it without having to show it. And that doesn't have a physical analog, but I think it is incredibly powerful for all kinds of things, or enables all kinds of things. And I think one of those things that enables is you can build a privacy preserving payment system, right? Or privacy preserving smart contract systems. So zero knowledge cryptography, people have deployed a bunch of projects that use zero knowledge cryptography, some of which use privacy, some of which are kind of more about scalability. But the bottom line is like, this technique is very powerful because it does let you do 2 things. Like I said, it lets you protect the reasons why a certain fact is true without revealing why it's true. And then it lets you compress a bunch of information into a single small proof. And both of those things I think are really critical in solving 2 of crypto's major problems. One, crypto naively, like Gen 1 crypto, Ethereum and Bitcoin, are just not scalable. Everyone's seen this. Like this is a conversation that's led to L2s, now L3s and whatever, right? There's the whole agreement is that like, hey, the bottom, like the initial way we thought about these networks is not very scalable. And so ZK provides you a way to like compress data and information into a small proof. And so therefore you can kind of scale these systems up. That's not the ZK part of the proofs, but like it's the cryptographic part. Now the ZK part is, I think, the really important part. And I think this is something that's very overlooked, is that these systems are not useful without some level of privacy. My view is that everything in crypto today, with a very few exceptions, is effectively a variant of a casino, right? Like the price is the product by and large for almost everything that's out there. And by the way, this is probably also true of how many people look at Aleo. I think that's unfortunate because I think these networks and this technology, blockchain technology generally, has a ton of utility for solving real world problems. Like I talked about refugees earlier. The reality is there's almost nobody that's building products for that. What do people build? They build basically, like go to any new network. Aleo is a good example, right? The first things to get built are always DeFi stuff on exchange. So if they get an airdrop, they can cash the airdrop out into stable coins, which is the next thing. So then they can go send those stable coins to the exchange and then get money out, right? If you look at 99.9% of crypto transactions, there's some variant of that. there's very few actual real world use cases. And I think one of the reasons for that is that, okay, what's a use case you can imagine? I talked about payments earlier. Maybe you don't want to disclose this, but I guess the question I love to ask in conferences is like, who gets paid in crypto as a salary? Who gets the entirety of their salary paid in crypto? Every once in a while, I'll get somebody who tries to like be like, I'm going to get you. And they're like, I get paid in crypto. But it's usually like a bonus or like some small amount. It's not their whole paycheck, right? Mm-hmm. Most people don't take their paychecks in crypto because the social norm around paychecks is like, you don't want to just disclose the entire world what you make. Right. And so, that's like, despite the fact that honestly, like payroll for international employees is actually a great use case for crypto, right? Because you can imagine, like, I got people in Luxembourg, I got people in Africa, like I'm just one universal payroll. I can just payroll to stablecoins. You would think there would be a killer breakout product just for this, but there's not, right? And I think it's because there is no privacy. That's one of the other big reasons that I decided to join Aleo, because now I guess maybe I should describe what Aleo is. Aleo basically tried to marry two ideas: Ethereum, which took basically Bitcoin and added smart contracts, so made it more programmable, and Zcash. And Zcash basically wanted to make private payments in the Bitcoin model. And I think Zcash, in my view, wasn't successful because it didn't have programmability. And Ethereum is very successful, but I think Ethereum's success is limited by the fact that there's not this ability to like have some level of privacy that you can define within a contract. And so Aleo's goal was to kind of marry both of those things: have programmable smart contracts and privacy. And I think the combination of those two things is really what you need, in my view, to have real products that solve real problems in the space. So maybe contrarian view, but that's my view.
Got it. And, privacy is obviously at very center of what you guys are doing at Aleo. And I'd be curious, when you think about how you define that in sort of in the most extreme sort of circumstance of like, hey, if this technology, Aleo is widely adopted and we see killer apps and so forth, how would you define that sort of in the future? And maybe even like, what applications do you view in like sort of a zero knowledge vector are like underappreciated or don't get enough airtime?
Totally. I mean, the obvious example that I always use is identity. Let's take a very simple example. So identity is a category. Let's take a simple example of like an application: age verification online. Like if you want to go buy a case of beer online or something, or if you want to go to visit a website that sells liquor and you're an American, like there's a warning, there's a pop-up that shows up on the screen. You're like, are you over 21? And what do? You just scroll to any date that you want to, and just say, yes, I'm over 21. You input anything. Basically, like there's no actual authentication based on age for any website today because there's no way to like cryptographically prove that in a way that like doesn't reveal everything about you, right? If you scan your driver's license or something, you got to send it to a server, and then they have to hold it, and then they're liable if they lose it, and then you don't want it, you don't know what's happening. So that's why that doesn't exist. But like something like Aleo solves this problem. In fact, we already have a product that we actually have like built an example, like a proof of concept for, called ZPass. And it's this exact thing where it's like you can take a passport or a digital identity, your school ID card, your driver's license. You can scan that thing using the NFC, like an NFC chip on your phone. You get the data from that NFC chip, and you generate a proof about that data being like, hey, I'm over 21, I'm over 18, I'm under 18, I'm over 13, right? So and this is not solvable without both a blockchain and zero knowledge cryptography. You need the blockchain because you want the data to be yours. You want to own it, right? You want to send it to a server, because if a server has it, like at that point, like there's no privacy between you and the server. And by the way, from the server's perspective, think of a server as like a centralized company. That's a huge liability for them to have like everyone's personal information. If they lose it, they could get fined a huge amount of money under the GDPR or CCPA, right? So they don't want it. So you need to own it. And that's where the blockchain comes in. And the zero knowledge cryptography piece comes in, because if I'm uploading my driver's license to the blockchain, I don't want that to just be out there. Like, just think it's like everybody can just access it for all time. No, of course not, right? And by the way, driver's license, I mean, there's other aspects of your identity which are much more private. Think about medical data, right? Like, so you need some ability to take this data that you have on chain, which is uniquely yours, that you can always access. But you want to be able to only selectively reveal that, or only selectively prove facts about that when you want to. So to me, identity is like the obvious killer use case. From that, I think you can easily build a real world payment system. And I think we need to distinguish payments here from like what most people do in crypto. It's like, you look at like even stable coins. I mean, stable coins are very primitive compared to like Visa, or thinking about payment processors like Stripe. I mean, there's a whole ton of like processes that get applied when it comes time to actually moving large volumes of money, right? I'm definitely not in the camp of like the crypto anarchists out there where it's like, oh, hey, we're all going to like have our own DAO. It's going to run the government. That's never going to happen, right? We live in a world of governments. sovereigns and sovereign nations, there are going to be laws that need to be applied, but you still need to worry about consumer protections. And so this is where, again, like privacy preserving smart contracts can come into play. You're a government, you're like, hey, we're going to issue a CBDC. Here's the 20 conditions under which people can or cannot issue the CBDC. And now here's a program you deploy in Aleo. Now, all I have to do is just prove that I either meet or don't meet all of those 20 conditions, and I can send money to anybody, or I can send money up to a specified limit. I mean, anything you can do in a smart contract, you could do here, but it's just the advantage is like, you're not just publishing all that on chain. I think with that, you can then build something that resembles like a PayPal or a Stripe or, a bank even, while still taking advantage of all the things that blockchain gives you, which is like instant real-time settlement effectively across any border around the world.
And you sort of mentioned this earlier in our conversation about there's not a lot of new ideas necessarily or necessarily completely new technologies, right? There's usually like different iterations. And so when you think about, zero knowledge proofs as an example, do you see certain convergences technologically? Like there's certain things that are happening out in sort of the macro, whether it's the ability, to marshal huge amounts of compute, other things that make sort of the current, sort of environment for applications of zero knowledge proofs more viable than they've been historically. How do you just sort of think about, where we are in sort of the adoption cycle and whether or not that's being sped up or slowed down or constrained by sort of the existing set of things that are available from a technological perspective?
Good time to share another lesson that I learned from Mark and Ben and Chris at A16Z is like, there are very, very rarely are there bad ideas in startups, but it's always a question of timing. Are you 2 years away or are you 10 years away? Right. And like, it's very important to know if you're 2 or 10, because that drastically changes the outcome for any individual. Right. And so I think that's I think that question applies very much here. Right. And I think zero knowledge cryptography, for those of you who don't know, was around since the 80s. And it was wildly impractical to do until around the mid 2010s, when there's, basically like aggregated breakthroughs across the previous 35 years made it practical to do something like Zcash. And by the way, the original version of Zcash took like 8 minutes to do an initial proof of like, hey, I have some money, I'm sending it to you, Alex. So 8 minutes is like, for a payments product, is like insanely an awful UX for any kind of digital product, right? And now we're at the point where you can actually have relatively complicated logic and you could prove that with under half a second. And that's so you take like 35 years to get to an 8-minute proving time. And then the last 10 years, you've gone from an 8-minute proving time of a simple circuit to a 500 millisecond proving time of a very complicated circuit. So now the technology is finally getting to the point where like, it's not just theoretical anymore. We can build these things. And so I think that's a really important inflection point. And that's largely, I think, been because of the cryptocurrency space, right? And the cryptocurrency blockchain space, because for better or worse, ZK has really been like the people's answer to the question of like, well, how do you take care of all these privacy problems in crypto, right? And people, whether or not they're deeply knowledgeable about it or not, typically like to say things like, oh, Aztec or like Zcash, right? So like, as a result, there's been a lot of interest and investment in these technologies, like as in Aleo, and we've been able to do a lot of R&D collectively across the industry to get ourselves to the point where now we can actually build practical applications using this technology. And now I think the real challenge in front of us, and this is, by the way, not just true of ZK, but it's true of crypto and blockchain, is like the products. We need products out there. They're building to solve real world problems that real people have. And those products just need to get iterated on in exactly the same way that like you kind of had the early days of the web, right? Think about Netscape era. It was like, we had a browser that was cool. And then everybody built websites, but okay, that was like, fizzled out in the .com boom. But then you kind of had the early aughts and 2010s where it's like, you really had like kind of product innovation. You'd be driven around, driving Web 2, right? It's kind of really, Apple was like at the forefront of that. But obviously, like all the social media networks, there's really kind of like a focus on experiences and solving problems that I think crypto is only just now getting to the cusp of. We finally built all this infrastructure that now we can do these things. And I don't think we can give ourselves the excuse anymore that the infrastructure is not there. It totally is, right? And now what we need is to build products. So now, how long it will take for those products to be built and whether or not they'll be adopted in 2 years or 10 is an open question. My bet, though, is I think we'll see it earlier rather than later. And I'll opine for 1 minute on why that is. Look, I think we're entering into a world where the fundamental value proposition for cryptocurrency and decentralized networks generally is just getting greater and greater every day. I mean, if you take stablecoins, a use case that I mentioned earlier, I don't think they're really being used very much for payments, but I'll tell you one area that they are definitely being used for is people who are using them to hold value, right? Across the world, people in Turkey, Argentina, Venezuela, Central Asia. It's a pretty massive market of people that want access to dollars effectively, right? And I think that's a little bit emblematic of like the global financial system sort of catching up to the reality of the internet era, right? It's like now you can access these things. So I think like as that trend continues to unfold, like there are going to be greater and greater opportunities for blockchains and cryptocurrencies to be able to solve these real world problems and offer products that are vastly superior to anything that exists today.
Yeah, I think that, to maybe dovetail off of your earlier comment on Web 2, I think, there's the applications need to be built. And then Web 2 really went through an interesting phase of really discoverability, right? I think people forget how much search really changed the game for being able to discover whether it's information or websites and so on and so forth. And then I think once you get past that discoverability component, there is an element of commerce moving online in a way that I think is really just defined, trillions of dollars in sort of global economic value, with the really large platforms, whether it be Amazon or you got to go down a list, right? And so I think we're in the early aughts of all of that. I think there is sort of the applications piece, there's a discoverability piece, but then I think all of the plumbing is really there from a commerce perspective, which I think makes this like a really interesting space, especially in sort of the near to medium term.
To comment on that quickly, like going back to commerce, and I think we're there in Web3, but I do think privacy is a critical part of that. Going back again to like SSL. Before SSL and Netscape, no one would buy anything online because you didn't want to send an HTTP request with the body of the message having your credit card number in the clear that anybody in the middle could just take, right? So this is the whole reason why TLS and SSL later became TLS was invented, was basically to facilitate commerce because you didn't want your payment information in transit across the internet, right? And in the same way, I think for commerce and commercial use cases in Web3, non-casino Web3, like to take off, you need privacy to protect your personal sensitive information.
So AP, I have a question for you that I think a lot of people are curious about. I'm just given the lack of like really deep knowledge, I think, by folks of like what the landscape in zero knowledge sort of looks like today. How would you describe that? And I think maybe a better framing for this for you is how do you think about Aleo's innovations and like what features and improvements we might see in the future and sort of how that contrasts or compares even to sort of what the existing landscape is of zero knowledge networks?
So first off, the one thing I would say in terms of like an innovation is like Aleo's live. It's not really an innovation, but it's more of an accomplishment. Like this thing is live. And like anything that I say on this podcast, people can go out, download a Leo wallet. Leo is like our main wallet. And you can try for yourself to do a proof and try to interact on a DEX or send a stablecoin or do a bridge transaction. And you don't have to take my word for it. I'm lingering on this point and not to brag, but just to highlight that in crypto, very often the message we get and give is the most optimistic version of the future for whatever technology we're building, right? And I think within ZK, there are many, many projects building. Key part of the verb is the ing, right? Part where it's like, it someday will be out, but it's not yet. And I think so for us, I mean, to me, that's like really my proudest accomplishment being at Aleo was like joining it just to start, like just had started. And now we've launched a blockchain that is live. And then of course it is imperfect in the way that any new product is imperfect and needs to get iterated upon, right? But it is novel in the sense that it is the first privacy preserving, programmable smart contract blockchain. Like there is not an equivalent anywhere out there, right? There are other projects like Minna, for example, has like integrates ZK. The use of ZK there is really more about succinctness, right? Less so about privacy, although they do have kind of their own version of what we have. Zcash, of course. And then there's Aztec and others building layer twos. You have all these ZK EVMs and like there's a lot of really, and now of course you've got like Risk Zero and all these things are like about off-chain proving and there's ZK VMs, all cool ideas. And it's way too early to know whether or not Aleo's model that we have, and we can get into depth on if you want. But like at a very high level, I'd say like we've taken a specific angle to solving, I think, problems that I described earlier. Identity. And then from identity, I think being able to like having a compliant payment system, right? It's too early to say whether or not the specific approach we've taken will end up being the one that's, the one that exists 10 years from now. I will say though, we're closer to knowing that ourselves than folks who are not yet live. And I think this is one of the reasons why I think ZK has kind of like gone in and out of vogue is because it's like a buzzword for a little while. And then like, oh, next year it's going to like all these things are going to launch. And then next year turns into next year, turns into next year, turns into next year. And everyone's like, okay, what is this? Like a research project? Or is this even real? Right. That's something that I don't think we in the ZK industry do ourselves any favors on. But like getting back to your question around the landscape, I would say there's sort of people that believe that ZK is really meant to like build how we have, where it's like, hey, you want on-chain permissionlessness is a key part of the story. I want to be able to generate the proof as a client, and I want that proof to be able to be ingested by a smart contract and do something on chain. That's kind of one world. The other world that people, I think, are building towards is, hey, the reality is these zero knowledge proofs are never going to be that practical for a client to run. Even 500 milliseconds kind of assumes some pretty powerful hardware. So like the reality is this is going to develop how Web 2 has developed, which is to say that like we have cloud infrastructure, apps are not run on like in on-prem data, in like on-prem computers anymore, servers, they're run in cloud, right? And so we're going to build all this cloud infrastructure, and we're going to, because we have this cloud infrastructure, we're going to have these powerful servers. They're going to be able to recursively aggregate all these proofs. It's going to be way more efficient, and we could do more complicated statements that way. Now, what do you lose in that world? You lose this permissionless aspect, right? Because you're effectively outsourcing this computation now to a third party. I personally believe that there are real use cases, again, identity, where it's like having client-side proving is really important. But, I can't point to a real world use case where it's like, hey, there's an identity product out there that millions of people use that are generating proofs on device, right? It's an open question as we continue to iterate on this technology and experiment with it. Which of these two models will become more preferred, or which one, or if both will end up being used and integrated in some way, depending on the application.
Got it. And you mentioned this, right? I know you guys at Aleo went through, a bunch of, sort of iterations and had delays in sort of mainnet, and like it's a huge accomplishment to your point to, be on the other side of mainnet and be live. As you look back, can you talk a little bit about like learnings, or frankly, just some of the challenges your team overcame throughout that period, and what lessons maybe that has for other folks in the space?
Oh my God. Do we have another hour? I feel like we need another hour. I mean, I don't even know where to start, but I guess at a high level, one thing I would say is that one big lesson I've learned is like when you're innovating in a startup, like you're doing something cutting edge in the startup world, only do one thing at a time. Innovate on one dimension, and everything else take out of the box. And don't try and reinvent the wheel. And I'll just describe an example for Aleo. So we have our own consensus mechanism called Aleo BFT, which I think ended up being really cool. I'm proud of how it worked out. I mean, it's a little bit more performant than something like Cosmos, like a Tendermint type style model would be. And it iterates upon what the original basis was, which was a DMBFT, which is like the Libra folk, or like Aptos and Sui. It's like their model. So it's really cool. We like added all this stuff to the consensus mechanism. There's a proof of work component. I think it turned out great. The reality is, that added 2 years to the roadmap, and we probably could have launched what was the meat and potatoes of our core innovation, which is a programmable, privacy-preserving blockchain 2 years ago. And if I had to do over again, I absolutely would have just taken Cosmos SDK out of the box and really made the focus of innovation be on this one thing, right? And I think it can always be tempting to like innovate on all these different dimensions. You can imagine it like this super product with like, if all these things just came together. And the reality is, and this is just true of any kind of like execution thing, is like, it's always messier than you think it's going to be. There's always things that you don't anticipate. And it's better to keep things simple and then get something out and then iterate on it, right? And this is like kind of the classic Steve Jobs, Apple product management mindset. It's like when you have something out, you know what people want, then you can take the direction of the product that direction, right? Then the thing sort of built upon itself in a feedback loop. I think that's one area. I think the other area is, investment. I think the raising venture capital can be a really powerful accelerant for a protocol, but honestly, it can also be a huge distraction. I mean, we raised across 3 rounds of funding, and we have a lot of fantastic investors, many of whom we would not be here without. But managing those folks and managing the processes by which you have to keep all of them happy is non-trivial and takes away from time that could be spent building the product. And, again, I think if I had it to do over again, personally, I probably would have raised a little bit less money, spent a little bit more time on that, and just spent more time delivering a product that people really loved, right? And it's tough because, there's no right way to do a startup, right? And this too, you're at your own startup. Like there's no one size fits all. Because, some people struggle to ever raise money. And so I don't want to sound like arrogant to those folks who are listening. I guess what I'm saying is my experience is that the inverse can be true. You can raise too much money, and you can raise money to the point where it's not really helping you that much anymore. I think that's something else that I maybe took away. The last thing that I would say I took away is like leading a remote team is incredibly hard to be able to effectively accomplish a grand goal, right? I think this is like, I live in Montana. I love living in Montana. I don't intend to move back to SF or New York or anywhere. I'm a big fan of not being in that. And as a result, I think we naturally have kind of built a remote organization. But the reality is there's a reason why companies like Apple and Tesla don't do that, because it is just much easier to execute when everyone is in the same room. I don't think it's even possible to do in the cryptocurrency space, nor is it even necessarily preferable. But what I do think it taught me is that leadership is critical, and not just leadership at the top, but you need leaders all throughout the organization who know how to be owners and know how to be accountable. And building a company like that is the only way to be successful in Web3 if you're going to be fully remote. That's a tip of the iceberg.
It's sage advice. And I think, will resonate with a lot of folks that tune in to the program. So AP, penultimate question here around what are the priorities now, as Aleo looks forward into 2025, what are the core things that the company, the protocol sort of needs to get right to sort of take advantage of being out there, being mainnet, and really into the next phase of the company?
Two big things. One, we need to be more decentralized. So right now we have a small validator set. It's about 15. I think our initial vision was hundreds. And, we started with 15. Back to taking my own advice from a few minutes ago is get something out there. This was a very much get something out there version. And, I think we want to scale that up because I think, again, I believe in the utility of a decentralized network. And I think we are decentralized at the current moment, but we could be more decentralized, more robust, more resilient. And I think that's definitely a priority. So I think that's priority one. I think priority two is, I hate to be a broken record, but iterating the protocol towards supporting application developers for identity products, for payments products, for other things that I haven't even mentioned or thought of. But bottom line is we are a product for developers, and we want that product to be as enticing and compelling as possible, right? It's not straightforward for us in terms of developer adoption path, because we have our own language, our own kind of bespoke stack. The privacy preserving smart contract model is just a little bit, it's different than Solidity style, right? And so I think we have a lot of work to do to make that more intuitive, to build tooling, which makes it easy to pick this up and start experimenting with it. And then supporting the application developers who build products that people want to use every day. So those are really the two big priorities.
If you had to bet money on which industries you think those apps are going to be built in, would it be financial services, supply chain? Do you have an idea of what that is?
Financial services, without a doubt. I think that because no one has yet convinced me that blockchains competitively serve a use case other than finance compared to existing technologies, right? Some people talk about gaming and stuff. But usually you look at examples of gaming in Web3, it's some kind of casino thing where it's I click a button and I get tokens, right? So it's really about the financial aspect of the game. It's not really about the game experience. It could be in the future that there are those things. But I think if you look today, what is crypto? It's sending money just like you can send an email. That is its superpower. That is what blockchains are great at. And that's why I think really, what does that mean? It means everything related to financial services is where I think you're going to see adoption of this technology.
Got it. So AP, we ask every guest for what we call the high stakes hot take. We ask for your boldest prediction for the Web3 or crypto space next year.
Oh man, boldest prediction. I think stablecoins are really going to be a breakout. And honestly, maybe I'll even be a little bolder. This is election day in the United States of America. I think without making a political statement, one of the presidential candidates has a cryptocurrency that are associated with a stablecoin project. I think the reality is both because adoption of those things are growing and also because I think there's obvious benefit for particularly the United States of America to promote stablecoin adoption. US dollar denominated stablecoin adoption is, I think, you're going to see that use case take off like wildfire. You're already starting to see interest in that from Stripe's acquisition of Bridge. I think you're going to start seeing bigger financial players starting issuing their own stablecoins. I think very soon now, the game is going to be all about stablecoins and everything else is going to seem like a sideshow.
Awesome. There you have it.
Hot take.
Yeah, exactly. Alex Pruden from Aleo. Thanks for coming on, AP. Hope to have you on again soon and appreciate your time as always.
Awesome. It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Keep exploring and keep innovating. Learn more at validationcloud.io and follow us on X and LinkedIn to stay connected as we continue to shape Web3 for institutions. This is High Stakes with Alex Nwaka, signing off.